Hi and welcome to my third basic chess tutorial. In our last tutorial we had the pawn in focus. This time we will take a look at the rook and see how it moves and captures. In our first example I have given white a king and a rook and black a king and a rook. Now the rook can move forwards and backwards in a straight line. It can also move sideways in a straight line. It cannot move diagonally. The chessboard is 8 by 8 squares, and since the rook already occupies one square vertically and horizontally, right now it can move to 14 different squares. The same goes for the black rook. It moves sideways in a straight line, and it moves forwards and backwards in a straight line. And if we count the squares, we can see that the black rook also covers 14 squares. So, as long as there are few pieces on the board, and there is no piece, your own piece or your opponent's piece, in front of your rook, then it doesn't really matter if your rook is in a more central position or if it's closer to the corner. Both these rooks have the same amount of squares they can cover. Let's play around a little bit with these rooks before we go over to our next example. And let's have our white rook move to f4. And as you can see, it moved sideways. And if it had wanted to, it could have moved here to g4 and h4. Nothing is really stopping it. The black rook decides to move forwards towards g2. And the white rook, after having moved sideways, is now moving upwards in a straight line, and the black rook is moving backwards to g7. And right now there is no way that this white rook can take the black rook on g7 here, and the reason for it is that rooks cannot go or capture diagonally. If the black rook had moved to g6, it would be right in front of our rook, which can move sideways. And as long as it's moving sideways and an enemy piece is there, then there is nothing against taking it. A rook can take head on, like that. But in most cases, black wouldn't put his rook up for grabs without having a plan. Here we have another example. In this one I have added 5 pawns to each side, and already you can see that the scope of the rook has become more limited. Our white rook on a1 can move 4 squares forward and 3 squares sideways. And the reason for this is on a6 we have a white pawn, and on e1 we have the white king. And just so it's mentioned, you cannot take your own piece, and the rook cannot jump over its own piece. The same goes for the black rook. It doesn't really have that many places to move either. It can move 4 squares forward and 2 squares to the side. On the left side of it, the black king is on e8, and the white pawn on f3 is stopping it from moving any further on the f-file. Now, we looked at this a6 pawn as our own piece, blocking the path of our rook. We also need to look at it in a different perspective. If it is blocking our path, we are also protecting it. which means if black could capture it, we could capture black's piece back. Black has 2 pawns which are undefended, the pawn here on a7 and the pawn here on g7. And to get to these pawns, our rook has to move sideways and up the board. We cannot take this pawn diagonally. So if we want to capture this pawn here on a7, we'll have to move our rook in this manner, and then we could attack this pawn. One more interesting thing to mention here is right now this rook is on an open file, which means there are no other pieces here. If one of our pieces now moves, for example, to c5, our rook would be protecting it. If an enemy piece moved to c5, we would be attacking it. From black's perspective, white has a lot of undefended pawns here, which the black rook can take by maneuvering correctly. As stated earlier, the rook captures head-on, which means the black rook can actually take this pawn on f3, but the value of the rook is much more than a pawn, and as we already know from our earlier tutorial, pawns capture diagonally and we would lose the rook in this situation. So black would not do that. I'm not going to go further into this position. The point of the tutorial was to show how the rook moves and captures, and I think we have gotten the point across. One last thing I would like to mention though is if this black rook took this white pawn here, it can't continue in a straight line any further. If it takes the pawn on f3, that's where it stops. Next time we'll take a look at how the bishops move and capture. Until then.